we have a major blockbuster winter storm.
That deadly storm battering the nation.
We have just learned this evening that Ian is now a hurricane again, growing stronger.
Nature is wonderful and delightful, making life beautiful. However, sometimes nature becomes the enemy, destroying life and property. Experts have warned of impending storms and floods in the US that can affect a large percentage of the population. Where will these storms and floods happen, and how bad will they get? Stay tuned and see the storm scientists say will kill millions of Americans. When last did you dance in the rain? Adulthood for most people means that you can't indulge in such simple pleasures. However, what about when water is everywhere and cannot be avoided thanks to a storm or flood? Californians may want to pay attention here, as there have been predictions of impending megastorms that may change the whole landscape of the state. California is not new to serious natural disasters like huge storms and floods. 160 years ago, the largest flood in modern history wiped out California, killing 4,000 people, destroying 1/3 of all property, and drowning or starving a quarter of the state's 800,000 cattle. California went bankrupt so completely that its governor, legislature, and state employees did not receive a paycheck for 18 months. The newly installed telegraph system failed, with only the tops of its poles visible beneath feet of water, and roads were impassable. And if you thought today's supply chain issues were bad, eggs cost $3 a dozen, or $79 in today's money. The disaster started with a snowstorm in the Sierra. In early December 1861, the eastern mountains of California received up to 15 feet of snow. The result, according to modern National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration researchers, was a series of atmospheric rivers. Atmospheric rivers are relatively long, narrow regions in the atmosphere, like rivers in the sky, that transport most of the water vapor. Alternatively, you can think of an atmospheric river as a fire hose that funnels moisture from the tropical Pacific toward California. They came for 40 days, bringing warm rain and high winds. As the water poured downstream, all of the fresh Sierra snow melted, transforming frozen creeks into raging rivers. The Sierra towns were the first to be hit by the disaster. The churning floodwaters devoured everything in sight as rivers overflowed their banks. Every bridge in El Dorado County washed away, taking ferry boats and mills with it. Several towns simply vanished. Chinese immigrants who were already forced to live in the slums were disproportionately affected. Entire communities were drowned in minutes. Of note is the reaction to the travails of the Chinese immigrants in the white-controlled media. While the comment below made by the Folsom Telegraph was extremely distasteful, it shows the number of casualties suffered by the Chinese community as a result of the storm. The paper joked, "The Folsom Telegraph thinks that those journalists who have centered many of their energies against Chinese immigration ought to be shocked at the superiority of water over their spirit in decreasing the Chinese nuisance," the paper joked. For it is not to be doubted that 2,000 or 3,000 Chinamen have perished in California since the commencement of the present rainy season. After weeks of rain, the earth could absorb no more. Water began to pool on every surface, destroying roads, infiltrating homes, and suffocating flora and fauna. Sacramento to the San Joaquin Valley, a 300-mile-long by a 20-mile-wide stretch of land, was completely submerged. Flooding reached up to 30 feet in the Central Valley. In Sacramento, the situation was no better. The town was no stranger to flooding either. It was located at the confluence of the Sacramento and American rivers and flooded nearly every year. This, however, was unlike anything the residents had ever seen. A levee built to keep water out proved insufficient for the devastating storm. Water poured in at first and then stayed, turning Sacramento into a watery punch bowl. Almost every home and building in town had flooding on the first floor. Sidewalks no longer existed. For weeks, rowing was the only viable mode of transportation. And those who remained faced another problem: starvation. There was little food as livestock, farms, and trade vanished overnight. A survivor named L.H. Powell recalled his trip from San Jose to San Francisco. The soggy roads took 36 hours to navigate. As he walked, he noticed bodies floating by in the swollen creeks. He came to a halt, he said, to retrieve a boy's body and leave it where his parents might find him. When the waters receded, which took until the summer in some parts of California, the state was forever changed. A quarter of the economy had been destroyed in a month, and more than $3.1 billion in damage had been done, far exceeding the $235 million in damage caused by the 1906 earthquake 40 years later. Another powerful storm battered California more than 100 years later in 1995. Wet, stormy weather with winds gusting up to 100 miles per hour ripped through Northern California on a December afternoon, killing at least 4 people and knocking out power to more than 1.6 million people while closing San Francisco area bridges to truck traffic. Schools in Oregon and Washington were closed as a precaution. In Oregon, the wind gusted to 102 miles per hour at Cape Blanco, and waves crashed 20 feet high against the Port Orford jetty. Off the coast of Washington, seas of 24 feet were predicted. Residents said they were scared spitless as it was the most frightening thing they had ever seen. The San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge was closed to tractor-trailers after a truck jackknifed and teetered on the edge due to high winds. Other trucks overturned on Northern California and Oregon highways and bridges, and the wind made the morning commute across San Francisco Bay Area bridges a nerve-wracking experience. The misery was exacerbated by heavy rain. More than 7 inches of rain fell in Kentfield, California, flooding intersections in the affluent Marin County town. In just 36 hours, the Russian River area of Northern California received 14 inches of rain. Wind gusts of up to 83 miles per hour shook the 52-story Bank of America building in downtown San Francisco, smashed a revolving glass door, and snapped the trunk of the building's Christmas tree. The Golden Gate Park was closed due to fallen trees blocking roads. The historic Cliff House restaurant perched above the Pacific had to close as a few blocks away the wind ripped down a facade and smashed windows. One resident spent a terrifying 2 hours trapped under a tree that destroyed his home in San Francisco's St. Francis Woods neighborhood. Utilities said 669,000 businesses and residential accounts representing more than 1.5 million people in Northern and Central California were blacked out. And thanks to the ensuing power outages, the San Francisco Examiner could only print about half of its usually weekday circulation. And more than 150,000 people in Oregon lost power, including the entire town of Coos Bay with a population of 15,400. A motorist in Oregon was killed by falling trees, and 2 women in their sleep and another motorist were killed in separate accidents in California. A truck-sized chunk of roof blew off the 16-story Port of Portland building and landed on the street below. Diners in Hillsborough, west of Portland, narrowly avoided being struck by an 80-foot tree that crashed through the roof. The Oregon governor was forced to send state workers home shortly after 3 p.m. and asked businesses to do the same. He later declared a state of emergency in the state's west and called in the National Guard to help clear roads, set up emergency generators, and restart water purification plants. In California, the storm ended an unusually dry fall season. The Sierra Nevada was expected to receive up to 3 feet of snow. And fast forward a year and the storms were back in California. The atmospheric event, which began on December 29, 1996 and lasted until January 4, 1997, caused one of California's most devastating floods in history. The majority of Northern California was drowned in more than 24 inches of rain, and because the storm was warm, rain fell at high elevations onto saturated snowpack. Scientists measured record peak river flows on the San Joaquin, Sacramento, Feather, Cosumnes, and Tuolumne rivers as a result of this, which exacerbated runoff and river flooding. Floodwaters inundated over 250 square miles of California, killing 2 people and injuring 50 others. The combination of high runoff from melting snow and heavy rainfall caused multiple levees along the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers to fail. The storm caused $1.6 billion in total damage, with $176 million alone in Yosemite National Park, destroying 20,000 homes and 1,500 businesses. The state declared a disaster in 43 counties, and the flooding displaced over 120,000 people. And yet, all these storm events pale compared to the massive megastorm that scientists have predicted to hit California soon. According to a report, there is an increasing likelihood of a 1 in 200 year flood in California, costing nearly $1 trillion or 4% of the US GDP. The study led by Daniel Swain concludes there is a greater than 50% chance of the megastorm occurring in the next few years. The failure of the Whittier-Narrows Dam on the San Gabriel River in the Los Angeles metro area, which could flood up to 1 million people, is one dramatic example of the type of damage such a storm could potentially cause. And given that storms capable of causing a $1 trillion flood in California have struck multiple times in the past, the researchers say it's only a matter of time before one strikes again. They pointed to the storm of 1861–62, which we have mentioned earlier, as a poignant example of what nature can do. And long before that, sediment research revealed that 6 storms even more powerful than the 1861–1862 storm hit California in the years 212, 440, 603, 1029, 1418, and 1605 AD. If a storm with an equivalent amount of precipitation hits California now, it could cause $900 billion in damage, according to a USGS study called the Arc Storm Scenario. The AR stands for atmospheric river, and the K stands for the number 1000 because the storm could bring in 1 in 1,000 year rains to some locations. The storm they predicted could flood up to 25% of all buildings in the state, breach approximately 50 levees, and force 1.5 million people to evacuate. Because there is very little data on the meteorological conditions that existed at the time of the 1861–62 storm, the USGS Arc Storm Scenario used a computer-modeled hybrid storm that combined 2 actual storms that hit California: a Southern California storm from January 19th to 27th, 1969, followed by a Northern California storm from February 8th to 20th, 1986. However, they added an additional tweak to produce a sufficient amount of precipitation to approximately match the limited observations of 1861 to 1862. The USGS Arc storm would cause $900 billion of damage. Approximately 55% of the damage was caused to buildings, infrastructure, and agriculture, while the remaining 45% was caused by business interruption. And they cautioned that these impacts were not even exhaustive because they didn't account for tourism and recreation, as well as the loss of cultural value due to damage to historic artifacts and sites. Thus, damages from an arc storm could easily exceed the $1 trillion mark, especially if one of these 6 strongest storms documented in the last 2,000 years strikes. And according to the recently released 4th National Climate Assessment, the frequency and severity of landfalling atmospheric rivers on the United States West Coast will increase as a result of increasing evaporation and the resulting higher atmospheric water vapor that occurs with increasing temperature. Swain's study yielded the same results. They used the NCAR Community Earth System model to simulate the climate of California under high emissions or business-as-usual conditions. The model predicted that a steadily warming climate would cause rare 1 in 200 year arc storms to occur once every 40 to 50 years. Strikingly, these findings indicate that California's major urban centers, including San Francisco and Los Angeles, are more likely than not to experience at least one extremely severe storm sequence between 2018 and 2060. This means that multiple $1 trillion floods are likely to hit California in the coming decades, unless major upgrades to the state's flood control infrastructure are made. The likelihood of an 1862-style megaflood goes from extraordinarily rare to just very unusual, according to Swain, and that is a big problem. California hasn't built any infrastructure to accommodate an event like the flood of 1861–62, despite the fact that we know it can happen because it has. The potential failure of the Whittier-Narrows Dam on the San Gabriel River in the Los Angeles metro area is a sobering example of California's infrastructure's vulnerability to an arc storm. The Whittier-Narrows Dam is one of many pieces of water infrastructure that may not be up to the challenge of the brave new climate of the 21st century. A dam failure could flood up to 1 million people in Los Angeles, with the highest water levels of 20 inches affecting Pico Rivera, a city of 63,000 people just downstream. The Army Corps of Engineers rated the 62-year-old earthen dam as the highest priority dam to repair of the 13 dams nationwide rated as high risk due to the potential for very significant loss of life and economic impacts. The dam, however, is the only one of the 13 high-risk dams that has yet to finalize an upgrade plan, putting it far behind schedule. The Army Corps sought more than $500 million in federal funding to upgrade the 3-mile-long dam, but the funding needed to be approved by Congress. The Corps hoped to begin construction on the dam upgrade in 2021, with the project expected to take 5 years. Sadly, California's flood control improvements may not be enough to handle an arc storm. According to experts' estimates, California's Central Valley requires $21 billion in improvements, and the state as a whole requires $80 billion in order to meet the current flood protection standard, a 1-in-200-year flood. This, however, will not provide protection against an arc storm, which is referred to as a 1-in-500-year protection. That level of security would necessitate an additional $21 billion in investment. And if we continue on our current greenhouse gas emissions trajectory, a 1-in-500-year flood will be more like a 1-in-50-year flood by 2060, according to Swain's research. Meanwhile, California is not the only place being hit by massive storms. 2022 ended on a sad note for many people, courtesy of a powerful Arctic winter storm that swept through the country and Canada. Large parts of both countries were under winter weather alerts that stretched from coast to coast and as far south as the US-Mexico border. The storm brought damaging winds and freezing temperatures, which could quickly cause frostbite. In the United States alone, at least 6 deaths related to the storm were reported. And as the storm showed no signs of abating, major airports canceled thousands of flights. More than 1.4 million people from Texas to Maine were without power due to power line damage caused by high winds. There were also reports of power outages in Canada, affecting 317,900 people in the provinces of Quebec and Ontario. The storm was so severe that, according to the U.S. National Weather Service, over 200 million people, or roughly 60% of the U.S. population, were placed under some form of winter weather advisory. And much of Canada was also under extreme cold and winter storm warnings, from British Columbia to Newfoundland. Several Ontario school boards, including Toronto, were forced to cancel classes, and the storm brought the coldest Christmas in decades. The National Weather Service, NWS, said temperatures of -50 Fahrenheit or -45 degrees Celsius and even -70 Fahrenheit were possible. In the United States, the severe weather was connected to several deaths. Due to poor road conditions, 3 fatal car accidents were reported in Kansas, and at least 3 others died in Kentucky. 2 were killed in car accidents, and another person described as housing insecure. In Fort Worth, Texas, a homeless man died after being discovered outside in the bitter cold. The Arctic air mass blanketed El Paso, Texas, with strong wind gusts and temperatures as low as 15 degrees Fahrenheit or -9.4 degrees Celsius, when newly arrived undocumented migrants were sleeping on city streets. Meteorologists labeled the winter storm a bomb cyclone, which is a term used to describe an explosive storm that intensifies quickly, with its central air pressure dropping by at least 24 millibars in 24 hours. The storm, which began in the Pacific Northwest on Tuesday, was described as a once-in-a-generation winter weather event by the NWS, with more than 100 daily cold temperature records potentially tied or broken over the next few days. Even Florida, which is known for its warmth, had its coldest Christmas in 30 years. And Cheyenne, Wyoming, set a record for the greatest one-hour temperature drop, dropping from 43 degrees Fahrenheit to 3 degrees Fahrenheit in just 30 minutes. Temperatures in the western state dropped as low as -35 Fahrenheit. Nearly a dozen low-temperature records were also set in neighboring Montana, and a winter storm warning was in effect in Chicago for several days, blanketing the city with several inches of snow and winds of up to 50 miles per hour or 80 kilometers per hour. Temperatures began to fall in Columbus, Ohio, New York, and Washington, D.C., and reached a low of around 10 degrees Fahrenheit by the evening. Much of Ontario and parts of Quebec bore the brunt of heavy snow, strong winds, and freezing rain in Canada. Several U.S. states, including New York, West Virginia, Kentucky, Georgia, North Carolina, and Oklahoma, had to declare a state of emergency, while Wisconsin declared an energy emergency. Some interstate highways, including those in western New York and South Dakota, were closed due to hazardous driving conditions. The storm flooded parts of the East Coast, shutting down rail services on the Long Island Railroad, while Lake Ontario on the U.S.-Canada border saw waves of up to 37 feet. Ohio Governor Mike DeWine described the weather as an unusual and dangerous situation, especially as people travel to be with loved ones over the holidays. And the storm caused havoc from Colorado to Kansas to Wyoming, as well as further north in Minnesota. In just 12 hours, the Wyoming Highway Patrol received 787 calls for assistance and recorded 104 crashes. And scientists predict floods in the U.S. will get even worse thanks to climate change. Flooding, like other natural disasters, is complicated by a number of competing factors that can influence its frequency and intensity in opposite ways. Climate change, which is exacerbating extreme rainfall in many storms, is becoming an increasingly important factor. Precipitation, snowmelt, topography, and soil moisture are all important factors in flood development. Some factors may be more important than others depending on the type of flood. A river flood, also known as a fluvial flood, occurs when a river, stream, or lake overflows with water, usually as a result of heavy rain or quickly melting snow. A coastal flood occurs when land areas near the coast are inundated by water, usually as a result of a severe storm colliding with high tides. Flooding can also occur in areas where there are no nearby bodies of water. Flash floods in particular can form anywhere there is heavy rainfall in a short period of time. Floods are measured using a variety of metrics, including stage height, which is the height of the water in a river relative to a specific point, and flow rate, which is the amount of water that passes by a specific location over a specific time period. And experts will often use the more simple term, a 100-year flood, to describe a flood that has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year, which is considered an extreme and rare occurrence. The term is a description of probability. Within a few years, a region can experience 2 100-year floods. With larger flood events, initial soil moisture is less important because there's so much water that the soil wouldn't be able to absorb all of it anyway. Any additional water added after the soil is fully saturated will run off and contribute to flooding development. Scientists warn that some types of flooding will increase if humans continue to warm the planet at their current rate through greenhouse gas emissions. First, as sea levels rise, coastal flooding will worsen. Melting glaciers and ice sheets add volume to the ocean, and as it warms, the water expands. Second, as more extreme precipitation events occur, flash flooding will become more common. Warmer temperatures increase evaporation, releasing more moisture into the atmosphere as rain or snowfall. Researchers also predict that as the climate warms, flash floods will become flashier, meaning that their timing will become shorter while their magnitude will increase. Floods that are more visible can be more dangerous and destructive. In a deadly cascade of climate disasters, flash floods may increasingly follow catastrophic wildfires. Because wildfires destroy forests and other vegetation, the soil becomes weaker and less permeable. Heavy rains on burned-out land do not get absorbed by the land surface as effectively as before. And even though it may appear counterintuitive to see both extremes, too much fire and too much water in the same region, the sight is likely to become more common, particularly in the American West. And this is apart from another prediction of danger in the US that the rate of flash flooding will also increase. According to a study published in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment, in April, areas across the country will experience more frequent and more severe flash flood events by the end of the century if greenhouse gas emissions continue unabated. Recent instances of flash flooding have been fatal. Rapidly rising floodwaters in eastern Kentucky killed at least 38 people this summer, leaving countless others to rebuild destroyed homes and towns. Over 50 people died in the Northeast in September 2021 after the remnants of Hurricane Ida dumped unprecedented amounts of water in a matter of hours. People drowned in basement apartments and were swept away in their cars as a result of the deluge. And the research shows in the future that the storms are going to get more intense and Americans are going to have bigger impacts from these events. Flash floods, unlike river or ocean flooding, do not require a body of water to overflow. Instead, flash floods occur when there is simply too much water for the ground to absorb. The amount of rain that falls and how the geology and topography of the surface deal with runoff determine whether or not a flash flood occurs. Because permeable soils absorb more water in a shorter period of time, they reduce the likelihood of a flash flood. Steep areas with shallow soils as well as recently burned areas are poor at absorbing water. Without vegetation, soil in burned areas will absorb less water, resulting in an increase in runoff. Some researchers used a model of the US landscape that took these factors into account and overlaid it with a future end-of-century climate model that assumes greenhouse gas emissions are unabated to study future flash flood risk. The climate is expected to warm significantly in such a scenario, which could have two opposing effects on flash flood risk. The study predicted that floods in the United States would become 7.9% more visible by the end of the century. They predicted that floods in the southwest US would become 10.5% flashier, and floods in the central US would become 8.6% flashier. Let's hear what you think about natural disasters in the comment section below. Section below.